Weight shifts in plank, be in a plank, either hand or forearm. The idea here is that we keep everything super still as we transfer the weight from one foot to the other. So we're not necessarily trying to lift, but rather just trying to shift the weight, potentially bringing one foot off the floor and then the other. But again, focus is on keeping everything really still, whether we're in a higher plank, lower plank, and actually taking a lot of time through that transfer of weight is kind of the point versus like snapping from one side to the other. Same thing can be done in butt plank, weight shift in butt plank. Again, butt plank is this lengthened variation. Hips can stay down or be slightly lifted. Lots of core activation. Taking one foot off, shifting weight to the other foot, slightly lifting or leaving everything touching the floor. The point is a slow transfer of weight from one heel to the other while staying really stable and still through the center. Bridge marches, similar, we can come up into a bridge hold and either just work on that same weight transfer, so slightly lifting one foot. Again, the lift is not important, it's that slow transfer, even taking that to a march, but still focused on that slow transfer of weight from one foot to the other and be really still and strong through our core activation. McGill curl-ups. For these, we're placing hands or potentially an ab mat under the low back to hold the natural curve of the low back, one knee up, other leg out, and the main focus is on breathing in, exhale, bracing through the center, and then lengthening out the top of the head while just barely lifting head and shoulder blades off the mat, and then relaxing. Squeezing in here, stretching along, holding, and then relaxing. You might hold for a breath or 2 breaths or 3 breaths, some on one side, some on the other, and that one hip extended, one hip flexed makes the deep core stuff work a little bit differently. Overhead lat lower can be done with a weight or just with empty hands, trying to keep everything nice and still, especially through the core, bringing hands all the way towards that overhead position, possibly even squeezing into the floor for a beat and then coming back up. You can walk the shoulder blades together so shoulder blades are flat to the floor, squeezing arms down, bracing through the core, squeezing hands into the floor for a beat and coming back up. Again, weight optional, PVC also optional. Siggy butts. So this is the Siggy butt motion, ball of the foot pressing into the floor, knee going in, knee going out. So I'm working on internal and external rotation, trying to keep hips still, and entire body still, and just moving the leg. So I could rotate my hips to make this happen, rotate my whole body, but instead really trying to stay nice and still everywhere except the legs. So squeezing knee across the center line, squeezing knee out, pressing more or less into that foot to get more or less friction. This is just activating the internal external rotators. This would be a high Siggy butt. I could be very high, fully standing, still doing something. I could also do this closer to the bottom of a squat. So squeezing knee across the center line, squeezing knee out, doing some on one side, doing some on the other side. Yeah, Siggy butts. Leg swings forward. So I always cue this, touching the big toes first, keeping everything else nice and still. Foot stays pointed forward on the front and on the back. It's really easy for people to think their foot is forward, but they're actually sending their toe out and opening at the hip. So you want to keep the toe pointed even towards the center line a little bit and keep the hip square. So that will generally reduce the amount of backswing that people have. Also keeping the pelvis nice and neutral, so core really on, avoiding arching through the back on that backswing. So it might not be a huge swing towards the back or towards the front necessarily. And that's the most important thing, but people can get their arms counter swinging, can get a little bit more backswing if they can keep that foot continuing to point in towards the center line, or potentially just stay nice and slow, some on one side, some on the other. Lateral leg swing, just swinging across the body. I like to mix this up with a sort of casual swing. People can use something for balance if they need. I also like to add pauses on both sides. That turns on the stabilizers a lot more. So swing, pause, swing, pause. Mixing that in with a more casual swing is a nice way to train control at those end ranges and just get some nice warm-up motion. Side squeezes, so standing up nice and tall, core solid, pelvis neutral, big toes touching, trying to keep that foot pointed forward as we squeeze out and come back. So I could tilt my hips and go really high, but the goal is to keep the hips really neutral and just squeeze out wherever you get to and pause and come back down. Could even do some pulses out there. Again, avoiding the temptation to allow the toes to come up and angle of the foot to change. So lots of core activation, lots of butt activation. You can take this slightly back as well for a little bit more glute activation as an option. Scapular push-pull. So this is just like a scapular push-up or scapular pull-up, but with nothing. So here I'm in sort of a front rack position of sorts. I can squeeze my shoulder blades together, push my shoulders forward. This would be a scapular push-pull. We can also do a full push-pull with the arms and focus on both that like top of push-up, shoulder forward, and then bottom of push-up, top of row, shoulders squeezing together, range of motion, or we can focus on that shoulder squeeze back through that full arm range of motion so the shoulders never come forward. This can also be used overhead, so scapular push-pull in an overhead position, and we could do similar things where we're doing like a press but keeping the shoulders down versus a press and allowing the shoulders to go up. Just being conscious, getting some warm-up of the muscles that control the scapula, as well as that range of motion. Scaption. So scaption is training, it's a movement to train the muscles that pull the shoulder blades down and together. If those tend to get weak or deactivated, the shoulders will sort of come up and forward when we don't mean them to. So if we start with the shoulders up and forward a little bit, then as we do a front raise with arms out to about 45 degrees, we can actually turn on those opposite muscles. So I say out to 45 degrees, so not straight forward, not way out to the side, but kind of splitting the difference in the scapular plane. So shoulders can actually start up and forward a little bit, and it's like a seesaw, levering the shoulder blades down, back, and together as the arms come up just to shoulder height. Weight's optional for this, and pausing at the top would be a great idea. Serratus rolls on a foam roller. So I'm putting my forearm, middle of my forearm on the foam roller, stepping out to a plank, and then squeezing my hands forward and back a little bit, rolling the forearms across the roller. A lot of core involved there, so I could do that on knees for a little less core. The main thing that I'm thinking about there is keeping my shoulders pressed forward as opposed to allowing my shoulders to come back at any point. So driving shoulders forward, arching across the upper back. Something like that. Hang press on the wall. So we're working with this and we're working on that hang position, like top of the pull for a snatch. So I'm getting my shoulder blades pinned together against the wall, walking them in a little bit, so my knees are bent so that I have some ability to press myself into the wall, pushing the elbows back as well, and then from here, I'm pressing palms down towards the wall and releasing. So I could go really far if I allow my shoulder blades to just come off the wall and shoulders to collapse forward, but I'm actually gonna keep my shoulder blades squeezed together and flat against the wall, elbows up at shoulder height, squeeze down into that space, come back up, squeeze down into that space, come back up. Doesn't really matter how far people go as long as they're holding the shoulder blades relatively flat to the wall. Diagonal glute squeeze out. So using a wall or a post on the rack or something, rig, getting a slight bend in my hips and then squeezing that heel out diagonally just to neutral, holding and coming back. So core is on the whole time so that I'm not ever allowing the pelvis to dump. So really tight through the center Squeeze out, hold. Could also do some pulses there. Great move for getting the glutes activated. Serratus roll on the wall. So versus doing this on the floor with a foam roller, we can do this similar thing on the wall. Again, my focus is just pressing the shoulder forward, arching across the upper back. And I can do some movement with my legs to move the angle of my shoulder. So I could go up on the balls of my feet and then come down. And I could even send my hips back a little bit and work through that range of motion. It's a lot less resistance than a roller on the floor, but I can still get that shoulder pressed forward and change the angle at the shoulder and continue to have the shoulder pressing forward throughout that. Spear thrusts. So I have a barbell here. This is about as heavy as I'd want to use. I'm going to step out into my kind of the top of a split squat. And then the main thing I'm trying to do here is stay really steady through my core. My arms are going to move out and then pull back in. I'm trying to keep my front shoulder from curling up and shrugging. So I'm trying to keep both shoulders neutral, slightly retracted and down. Pushing out makes me want to do this. So I'm just resisting the urge to change my stance or change my core at all. So lots of core activation, squeezing out, squeezing back. People are going to want to move their legs a lot. This is just settling into this stance and changing our center of gravity by moving away and back. So a lot of shoulder stability, a lot of core, doing some on one side and then the other. I guess you could do it this way. That feels awkward and like it's going to twist my back. So arm back, same leg back is how I'm doing it. Closer to the middle is going to make this a lot easier. Both hands a lot closer to the end makes this a lot harder, especially on the core. Cuban curl. So starting in goalpost, shoulders are neutral, upper back active, pressing the palms down towards the floor just as far as I can go without allowing the shoulders to change. So again, shoulders start neutral, squeeze slightly down and back, squeezing palms towards the floor, but not allowing them to do that. Squeeze, come back, squeeze, come back. Unweighted, that's a great just range of motion drill for things like the hang position for snatch, etc. With a weight, it's going to work on some of those shoulder external rotators, making them a little bit stronger. Same things, squeeze, squeeze back. A lot of activation in the upper back, keeping the shoulders from sliding up or forward during the move. Banded or ball leg drops. Banded leg drops, I'm going to be putting a mini band around my feet and then squeezing in really tight with the core. I can turn my feet slightly in or slightly out, but I'm going to be pressing out with the band and then lowering just as low as I can get while keeping the core neutral. Maybe hands under the hips will help make that a little more stable. The main focus is on that tension out into the band and core activation. So we're trying not to allow the back to lever up off the floor and then squeezing back up, trying to keep the center of the body really still, lowering just as far as people can go and coming back up. And that activation against the band tends to stabilize at the hip to eliminate some of that clicking and popping that can happen. Leg drops with ball. Our aggression here would be to squeeze with the knees, lower and lift the ball. You could even do that with legs extended, same thing. Squeezing in, it's going to add some stability to the hips and challenge some of those muscles. Squeezing the ball, this is a 10-pound ball, and even that is like a pretty big challenge. Squeezing down, squeezing back up, being really careful not to accidentally drop. Even a 10-pound ball dropped straight down from the feet could be a bad idea. Bad things could happen, so caution around that. Banded hip abduction. So this is very similar to a squeeze out, starting with both feet pointed forward, shifting weight to one side, just squeezing out and squeezing back in, or allowing that to come back in. With a black mini band, that's about as far as I can go. Again, just avoiding changes in angle of the foot, so not trying to engage the hip flexors by pointing the foot out, but keeping everything nice and still. Also avoiding lots of leaning to the side to do more, but rather keeping everything more or less upright. Squeeze out, pause, squeeze out, pause. Could do pulses out there. Woo. Core has to be pretty active to keep the pelvis nice and neutral. Banded hip swings. So instead of just squeezing out, I can squeeze out and then move that foot towards the front, back through the side, and around back. So I'm going to change the angle of my torso a little bit as I squeeze back. In this way, I'm just keeping tension on the band through a bunch of different positions of the hip, challenging a wider variety of hip stabilizers. So again, squeezing forward, foot stays pointed straight forward as I make an arc out to the side. Banded hip swing arcs. External rotation flashers. So the key to these is keeping the elbow in pretty tight. So even taking an ab mat and squeezing it under the armpit is going to help. From there, I'm doing one at a time, taking that shoulder into external rotation, squeezing out to the side. An orange band or a red band could work. You could do both of these at the same time, but it gets a little bit weird with the upper back having to squeeze against itself. So one side and then the other is probably a little better. And again, we can do this really easily with very little activation of what we're trying to activate if there's not the intention of squeezing in. So holding an ab mat or something is going to make this a lot more effective in terms of activating those external shoulder rotation stabilizers. Banded reverse fly. I like to go palms up. I like to think about putting the shoulders in a nice, strong, retracted neutral position to start with, which doesn't necessarily mean like hugely pinned back excessively. It just means not up or forward. So nice, strong, neutral, upper back is already active. And then squeezing out, it just continues that activation of the upper back, holding shoulders down, and then squeezing shoulder blades together at the end to kind of finish that upper back activation. Using a band here could be done without a band and still get a lot of the same activation. Could be done in a bent over position to allow gravity to help with some of that. Squeezing at the end is important, but most important is just keeping that shoulder neutral throughout the range of motion as opposed to allowing it to collapse up or forward. Supine bench curls. So I've got a fairly light dumbbell. I'm getting on my bench, and then I'm allowing that dumbbell to press my arm into extension of the shoulder. So for me, I can take the dumbbell down to the floor. Other people might end up not going all that far. The dumbbell, or whatever weight, could be a 5-pound plate, is going to help pull the front of my shoulder open a bit. And from here, I'm leaving the elbow where it is and doing curls. The weight is continuing to pull my shoulder into extension, which is a stretch that most people need. The work of the bicep curl there is helping to claim that position. It's also helping to run the bicep tendon through that extended shoulder position. This is going to help with things like bottom of push-up, top of row, strength and stability of the shoulder. Chest fly negatives, best done on a bench. We're thinking more about range of motion with these, so walking the shoulder blades together, squeezing the feet into the bench, unless you want to have feet on the floor, not necessary in this case. Long, slow, negative, allowing the relatively light weights to take us into somewhat of a stretch, and then coming back up. So the weight should be super manageable so that the stretch is optional and not forced and aggressive. So nice optional stretch, allowing the weight to just pull that stretch slightly deeper, and then having to activate those same muscles to come out of it. So we're doing an active resistance stretch, tends to be fairly good, but walking the shoulder blades back and together first, we want to again avoid the shoulders coming up and forward through that range of motion. Copenhagen plank. Yeah, it's made in Copenhagen. So this is a side plank variation with one foot on a bench, the other foot can be on the floor. So as I squeeze into side plank, I have the option of putting a bunch of pressure on this top leg. So that's activating adductors, inner thigh stuff, trying to stay really strong and slow through the core. I can even go so far as to lift my other leg. I can even go so far as to squeeze into the bench, activating both inner thighs. Things that could happen is people could forget about their core and really arch through the back and break at the hips versus being strong and neutral and lengthened all the way from the knee through the hip to the shoulder. So we want to keep this on, keep glutes on, only lifting and squeezing if that's possible for individuals. Could also do this from the knee and get the knee on the bench instead of being way out at the foot. That's going to be a lot easier, possibly easier even to lift or squeeze instead of being way out at the feet. We did it! Half kneeling pull-off, I think is how you say that. So getting into half kneeling position here with a band at about diaphragm height. Pulling the band into my front makes me want to sort of rotate and also makes me want to fall over. So I'm trying to keep really strong and steady, and then I'm pushing out, extending the lever arm, which makes me want to do that even more. So the goal here is to keep the core strong, keep the shoulders and spine from rotating as you extend the lever arm, and then take some of the pressure off by pulling back in. We can do a little bit of work on shoulder stability in this as well, but mostly it's about anti-rotational core stuff. To do the other side, I would do that so my knee that's on the floor is closer to the post. Banded spear thrust. So we are getting a band on the tip of the spear here, and I'm pulling out just enough to sort of make it challenging, and then from there I'm pushing out and pulling back in. So my goal is to keep that rotational energy on the PVC as I push out and pull back in. Same thing as the other weighted spear thrust, and it's that I'm trying to stay still with my lower body and not allow myself to be rotated. Even this red band is probably a little bit too much. Probably an orange band, light orange band is going to be better to allow for a little bit more stretch to happen. So close in, there's a little bit less resistance, a little bit more, a little bit less. Other side, same thing. Rotating against the band, pressing out, pulling back in. Banded asymmetrical overhead press. Banded asymmetrical overhead press. So a banded overhead press I could do with just a PVC. I'm just giving myself a little something to pull against. So I'm pressing towards that overhead and then pulling back down. And the band wants to pull me forward. And so I'm just having to work a little extra hard to keep stacked, probably head height or slightly higher for the attachment for this. And working slowly through that full range of motion would be the challenge. Asymmetrical is that I'm taking the band off to one side and doing the same thing. Again, this is sort of anti-rotational work, so the band makes me want to rotate, and I'm working against that on one side and then the other. To do the other side, I'll just step to the other side of the band and do the same thing. Stepping back just enough to feel a little bit more challenge. banded overhead pulses. So I'm reaching towards an overhead position and then just pulling against the band and doing some pulses. Important here not to arch through the back and try to pull by crunching the back, but rather to get nice and strong first. A little bit of tension between the hands on the band and then pressing towards overhead for some pulses. Front rack Cuban curls. So if our normal Cuban curl is coming down like this, I'm imagining a front rack Cuban curl being with the elbow sort of in the position of a Cuban or of a front rack position, elbow in the position of front rack, and then we're trying to get some rotation of the shoulder, which looks like levering the forearm back. So I could do this with a weight, but I'm going to show it with a band. If you did it with a weight, it'd be, you wouldn't do both sides because you'd be crashing your knuckles together. So it'd just be one side squeezing towards that front rack position with the elbow sort of staying not pointed straight ahead, but more like where you're aiming for with that strong front rack position. So band probably a little bit low, like hip height, coming here, squeezing back towards that front rack position. My goal is to keep the elbow more or less still in space, but that's pretty challenging. So could do this with a lightweight or a band, or with nothing. You could just work on that range of motion and work against the sort of natural resistance in our shoulders. Banded adduction with stride. So this is my banded adduction, just squeezing in, adding a stride motion to that. So once I'm squeezed in, I can take myself through a little bit of a butt kicker, lifting heel towards the hips, coming out into more like a high knee, squeezing heel forward, squeezing heel back. So I'm moving my hip through more or less that full range of motion of like a running stride. I can do that forward and reverse. The goal is to move slowly through all those ranges of motion and not allow the band to pull you off center through any of that. So banded adduction with stride. Banded adduction. So just having the band around the center of the foot, I'm squeezing feet together and then releasing. I can hold that squeeze. I can scooch out for a little bit more tension, trying to have feet more or less pointed straight forward, trying not to compensate with hip movement at all, but rather trying to stand up nice and tall, be balanced, squeeze, release. Another good challenge is squeeze, step down, and then release that foot from the floor without having it weighing out to the side. So step down, release, step down, release, turning the stability on before it's needed in that step. Banded adduction. Banded internal rotation at the hip. So with my knee bent, the band pulling off to the side makes my hip want to externally rotate, so I'm working against that. It's kind of like a banded ciggy butt. So working on that internal rotation. I can also do the seated, which generally feels a little bit better. Same thing, where my foot is really changes the feeling of this, but still just trying to squeeze the knee across the center line. And I can do this more upright for a more hips flexed challenge, or lying back for a more hip extended challenge. And again, if my foot is out a little bit, it changes it quite a bit. Other side, I have to rotate around like that. Banded adduction with butt kicker. So adduction means I'm pulling away from my center line. So I'm just gonna load up to a place where I feel like I have some control over this. I'm having my standing leg in front. Oop, that's too much. So then from here, I'm trying not to let the band pull me across or twist me, and I'm trying to reach my heel up towards my butt and then come back down. This can be more like a lift straight up, or knees can stay close to each other going straight back. Woo. That one's a little bit harder because it's tapping into some of the internal rotation muscles. So I like both of these for different reasons. Either heel going straight back or heel coming up. But again, slow through the range of motion, picking a distance from the post that is challenging but doable. Banded adduction knee raise. So band is pulling this foot across center line. I'm just trying to bring my knee up in front and then back down. And the band wants to rotate me at the hips. It also wants to pull my hip into external rotation. So I'm having to work some internal rotation stuff to keep that shin vertical. Also trying to keep core on to keep my pelvis from rotating or from tipping side to side or forward or back. Slow through the range of motion. Shabam!